As I listen to all of you speak, as I said, the question of how do we remember, and maybe I should make it just a slightly more pointed on, because when we have these inflection points like we have now, we all know the brain research of being in fight or flight mode and not being able to engage your prefrontal cortex and your reasoning skills and all of that goes away. So my question really is, with all of your various experiences, how do we institutionalize remembering?
Yes, yes.
If that makes any sense.
Absolutely. So those of you who were with me yesterday will find no surprise in what I'm about to say. For me, and I've mentioned it already today in some respects, it is about committing to doing that. I believe in recognizing the power that we all have to make a difference, and recognizing that our lives are precious and short. For most of us, we have no idea whether we're going to live out the rest of this day even. So when you combine the preciousness and the limited nature of it, and you recognize we're all suffering in some way, then that invitation to choose how you want to live is a real one, and it's a daily one. And so if you see that invitation to choose how you want to live, and really recognize that remembering is not easy, and caring for people who look different is hard, then to me, making intentional a commitment to remember is the first step. Get your neocortex in line, like with, okay, I'm gonna practice remembering. And then, as you pointed out, it's hard for us neurobiologically to remember to do something that goes against our deep training and that can invoke, fear and trepidation, the fight or flight dynamics that we know are natural to our biology. So we need to balance that out with practices that help us feel joy and connection. This is why we sang. This is why, the gospel music session last night resonated so deeply with many of us. Singing the NIH, where I'm privileged to also be affiliated as a member of the advisory committee on the National Institutes for Integrated Health and Care, we know that the scientists are telling us how important movement, song, dance can be to help counterbalance, disrupt the fight and flight. So last night we sang literally a song I created to help us remember. Remember love, remember the sun, remember the family, remember we are one, remember, right? And so it's simple things, singing together, creating spaces where we can connect, making it a practice to wake up and pause and recognize this beautiful planet that we're in. If it's a little window, go to a window. But making these kinds of things a part of our regular practice is, I think, a really important first step.
Nice. Rabbi, you're obviously in a synagogue,
Yes.
so you have
We do a lot of institutional and communal memory as Jews, and I have to share, Lyla, while I really appreciate, Layla? I want to make sure I pronounce her name right.
Lyla.
Lyla. As a Jewish person whose, whole culture is built around memory, you're, in the spirit of radical vulnerability, your framing of the conflict was really hurtful to me. That the framing of the conflict as an indigenous people fighting against the American colonialist with manifest destiny. I, every single year on Passover, say next year in Jerusalem. At every Jewish wedding, we break a glass to remember the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The framing of the Jews as a people who had no actual connection to the land, but were simply there because of some manifest destiny that they kind of believed was something, to me, felt really hurtful. And while I, again, appreciate Americans, we should stand up and tell our representatives how we think our tax dollars should be spent. And it is an absolutely reasonable and ethical position that they should not be spent in this way. And militarily, the framing of this conflict as a people with connection to the land versus a people with no connection to the land, to me was hurtful precisely because of memory. and that memory is deep, and that memory is not just about what we ourselves remember, but it's what our people remember. It's what we remember in our bones. And as Jews, we have generational trauma. And as Palestinians, there's also generational trauma. And that doesn't mean that one person's generational trauma is better or worse or more valid or less valid than others. But to discount one of those in favor of the other, to me, felt really difficult to hear. And the Jews who are now living in Israel are descendants of people who were kicked out of their homes in Europe, who were kicked out of their homes in Iraq, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Iran, in all of these countries that said, we don't want you. And they went to this land. And maybe they do things there that we don't want them to, or you don't want them to, or I'm not proud of, or all of those things. But to frame this as a people who went to try to conquer, who went to try to take over land with which they had no connection, to me is really painful and really harmful. And I think that that doesn't mean that we can't, you know, again, as you said, expand the circle for whom we care about. And I think that people who are Jewish and all people who have connection to that land need to be able to expand our compassion and expand our empathy and be able to identify with those who are dying, because no one deserves that. And unless we lean into our memory, unless we lean into our communal remembrance of what happens, I think that we come out with a paucity of understanding and a paucity of ability to empathize if we discount the memory and the institutional and lived generational history of the other.
Thank you very, very much for sharing that. And I agree that clearly your ancestors are indigenous to that land, and that is something I want to honor. I think the only parallel between the Manifest Destiny was that America felt as though it was their divine right to conquer a people. And I think there's a notion that God has ordained that. I'm not saying you think this, I know you don't, but some people think God has ordained people to wipe out a people and overcome a land. So that's the only parallel. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I watched a brief interview with a woman, and they said, you know, what would you tell a Palestinian child who, you know, wants to live where they were born and all that? And she said, again, not saying this is a universal perspective, it's just one perspective. She said that God has ordained us to be here, so it doesn't matter what you want as a child, you can't stop what God is going to create. And I think that's the only parallel between Manifest Destiny, is that America essentially said, you know, they were standing in Washington, D.C., and they were looking at San Francisco, and they were saying, all right, sorry, Native people, God has already ordained that we're going to take this whole thing over, so you can't really argue with God. And obviously, the Creator, whom we all on this panel know and love, is about love. And so that's all I wanted to say is when I was, and I appreciate you telling me that, and I want to say I'm sorry for the pain that it caused. And that I am deeply appreciative of you and your people and your lineages. I was just standing with a large group of beautiful Jewish brothers and sisters in a March for Palestine recently. So I know it's not about religion in any way, shape, or form. It's about what is wrong and right. And I think we all agree here that no matter where the child is from, Israel or Palestine, they deserve a life. And they deserve safety. And so I just want to thank you for saying that.
You all touched upon one way or the other, leaning in on the conflict, leaning in, being vulnerable, being brave. And I just want to thank both of you for being very, very brave to have this conversation in a very, very public setting. I assume that the genesis of this very conference is how do we have these very, very, very difficult conversations in a way that we could potentially start to resolve it or restructure our society in a way that we prevent this from happening because we did the groundwork. And that's kind of what I was getting to with, I look back and we see every day in the paper, a society that our institutions have decayed, they've rotted, they don't train us to see the world in this way. And my hope is that we use these very traumatic experiences to say we don't want to do this anymore. Whether it's institutional poverty or what's happening on our reservations or what's happening in the Middle East, the school shootings, I think there's a collective exhaustion in the country that we don't want to keep doing. And I think it's really important too that we see these young people here because, quite frankly, we need you to engage in the kind of conversations that you're hearing up on the stage. And I hope that Lyla and Ben have modeled for you on how to handle this kind of conflict, because it is difficult and it does take bravery to encourage to do it in the way they did. And so I consider this already, a success. The key too is the turning, and Joseph Campbell talked about this in his very often, turning thous into its. How do we turn thous into its so that we can be in a position, or people think they can be in a position to slaughter, to murder, that it's okay because they're not divinity, they're not people that we are connected with. And so again, I think it's important how we think about the institutions. How do we have institutions in our schools, in our churches, in our synagogues, and create an environment where we can actually instill this viewpoint. And I'm just open for ideas. I think, and those of you who are on the front lines of this, I would love to hear any thoughts that you may have on how we could take the conversation that we're having here and actually try to embed it into our current institutions.
Yeah. Well,
and you were in the military. And
I was in the military. I'm a law
in
professor, and for the past 20 plus years at my law school, I've been bringing opportunities for practicing meditation and also just, creating a space for cultivating awareness, for cultivating compassion, for centering on our values, for bringing more intentionality into how we take the knowledge, skills, and values that are traditional to teaching law into the world in ways that can maximize our ability to really find common ground. When I went to law school, we weren't creating spaces where you could figure out, all right, how is it that I can stay in touch with my heart, even as I take, this new set of skills I've picked up as a lawyer into the world. We weren't given courses and seminars where we could do that. I'm part of a network of folks who have been doing that at different law schools. And as a consequence, next week I'll go back to school and hold a space for conversations about this very issue. And this is something that is being done in our institutions these days in ways that wasn't being done, decades ago. So that's something to celebrate, actually. Change is happening around us. There is more receptivity to actually being intentional about how do we resolve conflict. Conflict is endemic. It's not a sign of failure that you have a difference of opinion. We have very different backgrounds and different ways of approaching the challenges of our time. So how to, find common ground, turn together to face something that we would like to see dealt with differently, as opposed to constantly reinforcing the notion of an adversarial us versus them mentality. Those, bringing about transformative justice, restorative justice, different approaches is what I think is happening and what we need to look for, celebrate, amplify, shine the light on, because this is where I think the future is demanding that we go, in the direction of finding ways to reconnect with our common humanity, and from that place, put ourselves together on the same side of our conflicts as opposed to constantly polarizing each other at the first sign of a dispute.
Rabbi, I'd be interested because we see protests, and I had friends that were at the DNC the other night and got escorted out, and you have bomb squads and cops, and it just spins out of control.
Yeah.
Can you share with us some of your thoughts on that?
So we have a concept in Judaism called machloket l'shem shamayim, which means an argument for the sake of heaven. And it teaches us in the Talmud some of the ways to do that. And I think it starts out with seeing the other, the stranger, as a person, not seeing someone who might think differently than you as inherently evil. It says that the rabbis who had machloket l'shem shamayim, that they still ate in each other's houses, they still sat down and had meals together. They were able to be together in community, even with people with whom they strenuously disagreed. And I think that we've lost that ability. I think as soon as we see someone on, and not to harp on social media, but you see someone on Twitter who you disagree with, you either unfollow or you clap back, or there's not really a desire to have a dialogue, to have anything in which you are listening. You just want to be right. And I think that there's a focus of so many of us of wanting to be right and wanting to be seen as being right, and that we get social clout or social standing by being right, by standing with the right thing, and that divides everything into a binary of right and wrong. And so then if the person isn't right, then they are wrong. And so when you say, I'm not really sure, or I think there might be a gray area, or it seems really hard to, then you're wrong because you're not right. And I think that breaking down some of those, and I think that a lot there, I have folks who work in the buildings that are being protested, and I have friends who are folks doing the protesting. And I think that right now, a big part of they're not talking to each other. And that's a big part of the problem. And that it takes a lot of bandwidth, and it takes a lot of empathy, and it takes a lot of, it takes your own spiritual and personal capital to be willing to do that listening. And we also have to recognize that when people are dying, when bombs are falling, when people are being held hostage, people have a lower threshold for all of that. And so how do we deal with this right in this moment? And then how do we build for, the tomorrow that we all, I think, hope for, when we are past this moment of acute conflict, and we move into, in this conflict, there's acute conflict, and then there's kind of low-level simmering conflict, and how do we actually move towards resolution? And I think the one thread of hope that I'm holding on to is if you had told someone in November of 1973 that by the end of the decade there would be peace between Egypt and Israel, they would have laughed in your face. If you told someone in 1945 that the Brandenburg Gate in Germany would be lit up with the colors of the Israeli flag in support of a Jewish state, they would have said you were out of your mind. And so there have been times throughout history when we think that there is absolutely no way forward between peoples, that we have found that way forward. And so my hope and my prayer is that we too, even when it feels like there is no way forward right now, that we will have leadership. And leadership has been complete and utter failure on all sides in this conflict. And I will not pretend to think otherwise. But when we have better leadership that can move us forward, that I'm hopeful that we will be able to get somewhere towards some sort of listening.
So there's a lack of hope. And I think, Lyla, maybe you could share kind of in closing here. You seem to maintain some level of hope.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you?
How do I do that? Well, hope. I mean, I often think to myself, peace is not only possible, but it's unstoppable. We may not see it in our lifetimes, but if you look throughout history, all of the civilizations that hang their hat on domination and oppression of others, they always fall. And the Creator always humbles them. If you look at my ancestors, we had the Chaco Canyon. We had a big city where we find parrot feathers from South America, or rather Central America, copper from Wisconsin, chocolate, right there in New Mexico, which now doesn't seem like a very interesting place to the world. They're often like, oh, you're from Mexico? Like, no, it's the newer one. Yeah, this was a huge city. This was a huge, bustling city before Columbus was ever born. And we had, unfortunately, we went the wrong way. And we started a caste system. We started to enslave each other. And we started to also enslave the earth to some extent. And around the year 1100, the Creator sent us a drought as a gift to give us the courage to change. And so the Creator is always helping us. The Creator is always, these things might look like punishments, but they're not. They are support systems to humble us and remind us we are not God. And so I think my hope comes from the fact that all of these cities that rise up in this false notion of hierarchy, whatever type of hierarchy it is, white supremacy, male supremacy, human supremacy, whatever it is, they always fall. And not fall in a bad way, though, but fall in a way where we learn. And so I think even this extremely difficult time now of mass extinction, of war, of division, of what they call the polycrisis, right? This convergence of crises, that this will be, as tragic as it is, and it will be an extreme learning moment for humanity, of that time when we realized, we learned the hard way, right? Like, oh, that didn't work. That didn't work to see each other as other. That didn't work to have, any race be above another. That didn't work to think that plants and animals and fungi and birds were less important than humans. That we have all these PhDs, but so much poverty. We have all these rocket scientists, but we have so much war. And when we realize that, that only led us to a precipice of global collapse. And so that type of learning, you can only learn by hitting the dust, And so to see these times as our gift of, you touch that stove, it's gonna burn you. But after you touch that stove, you heal. After you touch that stove, you learn, right? Don't touch that stove. And so I think, believe it or not, I think this earth is designed to self-regulate. And I think this earth is designed to bring us back on course. And as they say, the proof is in the pudding. So if America rises and falls in less than 300 years, that system wasn't really working, right? I'm not saying we're falling completely, but I'm saying our ecosystem is, for sure. And so that didn't work, right? So if you look at it from a more longitudinal perspective, that we are in the middle of forever, that, as John Trudell says, then we are actually only ever going to refine ourselves, evolve ourselves, and get better and better and better as people. And that's our job now, to take these big brains and opposable thumbs and not use them to dominate, but see that these are tools to give us the ability to care for life on Earth. And that's what we're here to do. It's like they said in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So this is not for us to be kings and queens of the world. This is for us to be servants of the earth and use what we have to give and to care for all life. So anyways, I'm out of time once again, but thank you.
Let me just say, we have covered a lot of territory, from deep quotes in the Torah to Spider-Man movies. But many times you come to these conferences and you hear speakers and panelists talk. But I just want to ask you to help me thank these panelists for actually embodying the vulnerability, the bravery, and the courage to have such a great panel. So thank you.